What happens before you start mentally reviewing everything again? Before the mental review begins, something else happens first. A small activation. Not a full thought loop yet, not the long internal replay. Just a shift. Something feels unfinished, unclear, slightly off. A conversation, a reaction, a possibility. A detail that does not feel settled. At first, it is only tension, a light pressure in attention, a pull to go back, a sense that something still needs to be checked. This is the moment most people do not notice. They notice the review when it is already happening, when the mind is replaying the scene, rechecking the words, rebuilding the meaning, trying to see whether something was missed. But before that, there is a quieter movement. The system stops letting the experience remain incomplete. It begins to turn back toward it. Not yet to understand it fully, just to touch it again. That return feels responsible, as if going back mentally were a way to be careful, accurate, prepared. But this is how the pattern starts, not with the full review, with the first inner turn back toward what was already over. The mind does not yet say, let's loop. It only says, one more look. And because one more look sounds harmless, the movement is usually followed without question. That is where the cycle begins. Not in the long replay, in the first quiet refusal to let the moment stay unfinished.
What gives this movement so much force is that unfinished things create mental pressure. Not always because they matter deeply, often because they remain open. The mind does not like what stays open. An unfinished exchange, an uncertain impression, a reaction that was not fully understood, a possibility that still feels active. All of these create a subtle demand, not yet for answers, first for return. The system wants to go back toward the experience before it even knows what it is looking for. This is why mental reviewing often begins before any clear question has been formed. The mind is already leaning back toward the event, not because it has insight, because it has friction. Something does not sit cleanly. Something does not feel complete. Something is still psychically alive. And instead of letting that aliveness remain unresolved for a while, the system starts circling. It goes back to the tone, the expression, the wording, the timing, the meaning. Not yet in a full loop, but enough to start rebuilding the event inside the mind. This is the important threshold, the moment when memory stops being passive and becomes active review. The event is over. But the system is no longer letting it stay over. It is re-entering it. Quietly, quickly, almost automatically. And because this re-entry feels like care, like responsibility, like trying to understand, it is rarely interrupted. That is why the pattern forms so easily. The mind does not think, I am beginning a loop. It thinks, I just need to look at this again. And that again is the beginning of everything that follows.
This is why mental reviewing can feel so justified. The mind believes it is being thorough. If something still feels active, then going back to it seems intelligent, reasonable, necessary, careful. But what is often happening is not understanding. It is re-immersion. The event is being entered again, not from reality, but from memory. And memory does not return neutrally. It returns with tension, with selection, with emphasis, with the emotional charge that made the moment feel unfinished in the first place. So each review does not simply revisit the event. It reshapes it. It gives certain details more weight, certain words more meaning, certain possibilities more presence. And because the mind is now interacting with a reconstructed version of what happened, the review starts feeding itself.
You go back to understand the discomfort, but the very act of going back this way keeps the discomfort active. This is the trap. The review feels like movement toward clarity, but often it is movement inside a self-renewing structure. The same scene, the same uncertainty, the same attempt to finally settle it. And because each replay makes the unfinished feeling more mentally available, the next replay becomes easier to trigger. That is how reviewing stops being occasional and starts becoming a mental environment. Not because one thought was so powerful, because the mind kept returning before the experience had been allowed to remain incomplete without interference.
This is why reviewing rarely feels repetitive from the inside. It feels unfinished. Each return seems to offer one more chance to settle the tension, one more look, one more interpretation, one more attempt to make the whole thing sit correctly in the mind. But the settling does not come, because the reviewing is not resolving the pressure, it is keeping it active. The event remains mentally alive because attention keeps reopening it. This is the crucial shift. The mind starts believing that returning to the moment is a path toward release, but often the return itself is what prevents release. Not because reflection is always wrong, because repeated re-entry changes function. It stops being reflection, it becomes maintenance. The discomfort is not only remembered, it is renewed. A detail is replayed, a meaning is reconsidered, a possibility is reopened. And with each reopening, the unfinished feeling gains more structure. Now the review is no longer about the event alone. It is about protecting yourself from having missed something. A sign, a clue, a mistake, a meaning that should have been seen earlier. That fear is what keeps the review alive, not clarity. The fear that letting the moment go would mean leaving something important unseen. That is why the review can continue long after the event ended. Not because the event is still happening, because the mind has not stopped treating it as if it still might.
Once this is seen, the review begins to look different. Not like insight, like return. A return that keeps presenting itself as necessary. And that is the part that changes everything. Because once the return is no longer confused with understanding, the pressure around it starts to loosen. The event may still feel unfinished. The pull to go back may still be there. But now, something becomes visible inside the pull itself. Not only the wish to understand, also the fear of letting the moment remain unresolved. That fear is what keeps the review alive. The mind believes that if it stops revisiting, something important will be lost. A meaning, a protection, a chance to fix what can no longer be changed. But this is the illusion. The repeated review does not protect the moment. It keeps you inside it. And once that becomes clear, another possibility appears. Not forcing the mind to stop, not trying to ban thought, only noticing the instant when return becomes re-entry. When one more look stops being reflection and starts becoming renewal. That is the threshold. The moment when attention can stop feeding the unfinished feeling with one more round of mental contact. This is where the pattern weakens. Not because the event suddenly makes sense, because it is no longer being reopened every time the pressure returns. And when reopening weakens, something finally changes. The moment is allowed to become over. This is inner cognition.